Yeah, of course. I appreciate the opportunity to present some of this stuff for reasons that'll probably be clear partway through the talk. Um, yeah. All right, let's do it. So yeah, this talk is teeny tiny bit work in progress. So not all the slides are as polished as I would hope they would be, but there's a global pandemic, so you do what you do. Hopefully this stuff is still helpful. So yeah, I would like to share some of the stuff that we've been learning around here about creative and technical production for running remote game studios. And a lot of this stuff is going to be about trying to reduce assumptions, which is something that I think improves the way that we do remote collaborations. So my name is Adam Saltsman, and I'm sort of the day-to-day kind of a creative director type role, I guess. But a lot of my actual responsibilities are a little bit more like a junior programmer or interim art director, sometimes a level designer, kind of a bunch of odd different things. And like Glenn said, we've been doing a bunch of different things around here with Finji, with Overland, with Tunic. We also published the BAFTA-winning story game Night in the Woods. We published a game called Wilmot's Warehouse, which is on Xbox Game Pass starting today. And yeah, working on Chicory, working on Exocolonist, a bunch of other cool things. So a thing that's kind of weird about Finji is that we've been working primarily remotely, doing game design, building games, shipping games, publishing games for like 15 years now. So when it comes to working remotely, which is something a lot more of us are doing lately, we've screwed up a lot and we've learned a lot about working conditions like the ones a lot of us are enjoying now. But these things might be kind of newer to other folks who didn't take the particular strange career path that Beck and I did. So I want to share as much of what we've learned as I can in this talk. So I want to start with a short story from real life, a story of a man with a dream. Back in the 1990s, John Hammond discovered that he could breed dinosaurs by collecting ancient DNA from bugs. The only problem was the DNA was so old that it had some holes in it, real gaps, not just plot holes. And that kind of thing is inevitable. So the scientists from Dinosaur Island did what any good problem solver and designer would do. They just made up entirely new, untested stuff to fill in the gaps and didn't stop to ask anybody what to do about it until way after the gaps had been filled. And everyone lived happily ever after. So try to think back about all the times where you've been on a project only to find out partway through that different groups or team members are kind of accidentally working on different but similar projects at the same time. Or every time you've done your best to guess at what is supposed to be in a spec and been wrong, or accidentally handed off a bad spec to someone else. We make assumptions all the time. This is the nature of human communication, but we can still acknowledge that assumptions are being made, and we can try to engage in production processes that can mitigate the negative effects of all these assumptions. And we can acknowledge that working remotely means we are at risk of making way more assumptions than we might if we were all in the same office. So let's talk about some ways to reduce those assumptions in our creative workflows. So let's start at the start. You have an idea for something. Maybe this is a new project, a new product, a new feature, a smart bug fix, a pivot, if that's something people still do. It's a new paradigm. You never know, right? You got an idea, or maybe just part of an idea. At the earliest stages of design and development, we're often in a pass-fail mindset when it comes to new ideas. We have a lot of language about this. Good ideas, bad ideas, right? Yes, that works. No, that doesn't work. And so on. And this naturally creates some pressure to make sure folks are bringing really complete ideas to the table, usually formulated and refined in relative isolation so they don't waste everybody's time. And this is, I think, pretty natural, intuitive process, but I think it's also kind of a toxic process. Design is pretty notorious for how interconnected things can be. collaborative design is always going to be bumping against the natural limits of what people can remember, what specs they can hold in their head, what parts of the project they're responsible for, and what problems they should know the answers to. And developing ideas in isolation means asking people who can't know all the answers to fill in all the blanks anyways. And I think we all know how that works out. But we do it anyways, all the time. Even in a studio environment that does have top-down support for collaboratively developing new ideas, though, this can be a scary process. And if you're in a studio environment or on a team that doesn't have top-down support for that, it's, yes, equally scary. So the feeling sometimes is like, hey, why don't you take your half-finished drawing and show it off to a bunch of expert artists and see what they think? Sure, that sounds fun. So the good news is that you can develop processes and language from the bottom up or top down to help calibrate folks, to set expectations better. And some of that can make this process a little less terrifying. And specifically this process of showing your like half-formed idea to your collaborators to try to improve it together, right? Core info that you're going to want to try to communicate during collaborative idea development should include things like, what's the problem? Like, what are you actually trying to solve? And what parts of your plan are done? What parts of your, halfly done plan are not done? These things sound kind of obvious, but they're actually pretty hard to spell out sometimes. But the goal is to try to get everybody caught up to where you are on the idea so far, so they know what blanks to help you fill in. Or you can think of it this way. If you want people to help you reduce the amount of assumptions you're making, you're going to need to reduce the amount of assumptions that they're making first. You can also kind of develop specific keywords and phrases that can help with this process. These are probably going to be different from place to place, but some of the ones we use sometimes are intermediate impossibles. This is a solution that you dislike, but it does address your needs. So something that's very ugly, you don't want to actually ship it, but it does solve the problems that you have, right? We have a house term we use of viable, which is a solution that we feel like we could ship, even though we still want to think about it more and try to think up something cooler. And then we have these other house term of risks and benefits, which are going to have its own whole section in a minute here. Because first we're going to talk about mock-ups. So pictures are still worth 1,000 words, it turns out. And I actually don't know where this picture's from. So funny to me, but let's say you're trying to pitch a new character for your mobile game, right? And this horrific monster of what I sort of am assuming is a dog, but might also be a clown or both, is already like 1,000 times more helpful for me to look at than reading, for example, a long essay description detailing in just language all the different traits and attributes of the terrible clown dog that you want to add to the unlockable avatars menu or whatever. Because at least when we both look at the terrible clown dog, everybody is seeing the same thing. And trying to put this puppy into a paragraph would mean introducing a lot more spaces for assumptions to happen. So being able to take advantage of mock-ups to help avoid huge assumptions about the core characteristics of your idea means you kind of need this foundation of collaborative idea development underneath it to make it work. You still have to do all these steps from before, and you're going to be depending on your collaborators to engage with you in good faith about your design. So you might have some notes attached to this mock-up when you're sharing it, like this mock-up is intended to demonstrate the silhouette only, not the character's actual mood, or imagine this silhouette, but with this other existing character's moveset, and so on and so forth. So here's a mock-up from early in the design of our strategy game Overland. I think this is a mock-up that could be relatively easy to dismiss or reject. The buttons aren't terribly communicative. The characters are arranged in a way that's kind of unintuitive. The car doesn't really match the button. They're like facing different directions. But there's a lot of stuff that it does communicate, right? The prominence and clarity of the map, the relative size and position of the player group, the number of buttons that we actually need to have. If I was trying to spec this out in just bullet points, instead of this admittedly kind of gross and rushed picture, I think it would have been hard to feel confident about doing the next step of development, which led us to this, which is the actual map screen that we shipped in the game. So I think even bad drawings can be pretty powerful tools when it comes to reducing assumptions, and making room for mock-ups in your process, I think, is going to be pretty beneficial. So you're at this step where you're collaboratively developing this new idea. You're working hard at reducing these assumptions. You drew some terrible clown dogs. You carefully annotated them. Now what? How do we have a productive discussion about a design idea, which, despite all the mock-ups and collaboration, is still fundamentally an abstract thing? How do you do it in a way where you're not doing that pass-fail thing that we talked about, that it can be pretty toxic? So what we've been doing lately is using a framework that we call risks and benefits, which is basically talking about the qualities and characteristics of the idea in terms of risks and benefits, and trying to see how much we can get out of that. So one reason that we like this approach is it has a tendency to move the discussion away from being about the idea itself to talking about the outcomes of the idea instead. So it's a way of talking about what would happen or what could happen in the process of actually implementing the idea. So for example, instead of instantly rejecting the terrible clown dog as a bad idea, we can actually take a minute and address the risks and benefits instead. For example, we could identify a risk of the terrible clown dog is unattractive and off-putting to most people. We could identify a benefit of it would be cheap to produce and flesh out the roster. We could identify a risk of it might be too similar to the other clown dog that we put in last month. But we could identify a benefit also of what if they're terrible clown dog brothers, though? That would be funny. And now we have like a more nuanced and complete picture of the actual impact of this idea, instead of just kind of stamping a fail on it or whatever. And another reason that risk and benefits is a useful framework, I think, is it lets us map ideas onto something called production gradients, instead of forcing them into these binary good and bad buckets. So for example, terrible clown dog might get rated very risky, but very beneficial. That tells us a lot more about what this idea means for us in actual production, instead of just giving it like the good or bad label, or saying we can do it or we can't do it. So for example, we might pipeline this idea to happen after things that are less risky and very beneficial, but probably before things that are very risky and less beneficial. And we'll talk more about that in a minute here. Because the other thing we can do is just keep working on the idea and trying to increase the amount of benefits and decrease the amount of risks until it gets a spot higher in the pipeline. And when we're talking about risks and benefits, we're also helping to reduce assumptions about the purpose of the idea, which is a place where we often make the most harmful assumptions, because it's such a foundational part of the idea, and usually it's one of the most abstract and hardest to communicate things. So risks and benefits help fence in the purpose so that we can increase the chances that we're all trying to solve the same problem at least. But the best thing about this framework is it gives us a way to collaboratively fill in the blanks, like we talked about earlier. The creator presenter can do their best to enumerate the risks and benefits they see, and then collaboratively, each domain expert or a team member can start filling in the rest of the blanks, augmenting and adding and reducing risks and adding benefits that the author couldn't see on their own. And finally, by funneling discussion about the idea into this risks and benefits framework and getting everyone into this outcomes-oriented mindset, we help establish some safe distance from the idea itself. Improving the results of the idea usually means changing the idea. And getting everyone on board with the notion that the idea might be changing is easier when we've already been discussing why and how these changes would help, what sorts of concrete improvements we're hoping to get out of it. And this can help protect the emotions of the person pitching the idea. And because their emotions are protected, it can also make other people feel more comfortable about contributing fixes, because they're more confident that they won't be hurting the presenter's feelings. Finally, like we mentioned before, ideas that are too risky to put into production don't have to actually be discarded. They can just go into a high-risk, low-benefit column where they can be revived and improved in the future. This obviously can be an emotional win, but it's also a technical and creative win, because we're establishing a system for like iteratively filtering and improving things and being more capable of removing our babies from our bathwaters when it's dumping day. Finally, the risks and benefits of risks and benefits are all of this stuff, which I think is nice. I like it. Like a good system should work on itself, and I think this one does, and I think that's a good sign. So I want to talk a little bit more about production gradients. So this slide is similar to the previous one, except it has more colors on it. And so when we're trying to like kind of pipeline things or figure out when to do something and how to talk to our collaborators about that, I think it can be tricky. And this is the approach that we've liked to use here and we rely on more and more lately is, so let's say you have your new idea, terrible clown dog, whatever. You're trying to figure out how to fit it into the schedule. Or you're at any part of any project where the priorities have changed or other new ideas have happened, whatever. The thing that's going to be happening here is something that I think it's helpful to think of it as displacement. So space and time are finite, probably, at least from our perspective. So priority changes are usually what we would call zero sum. If you're adding a task, you have to take some tasks away to make room for that to happen. And so my favorite way to talk about this with collaborators is to make it very explicitly about before and after instead of can happen and can't happen. This probably isn't a surprise after the stuff we've been talking about so far, but when you're talking about displacement especially, it's emotionally healthier, but also more production realistic to phrase it as, oh, these tasks can or need to happen for this milestone. And these other tasks, they can't happen for this milestone. They have to happen for the next one. So trying to figure out before and after the next big development goal, right? And like everything else we're covering, this is a way to make a hard decision less emotionally charged, but this is also just going to match your other production practices and burn down lists better. Okay, so this has been a lot of information. I apologize for the sort of waterfall dump approach here, but let's say you've got all this stuff. You're running a great collaborative ideation process. Assumptions reduced, frog DNA almost none, dinosaurs amok very few. You might be thinking to yourself, wow, this process is so smooth and mature, and we were so thorough that I probably don't have to check in on my collaborators as these different pieces get implemented. And I don't want to interrupt or be too hands-on or micromanagey or whatever. Or you might be thinking to yourself, what if my collaborators haven't kept track of every single detail that we discussed? And just in case, I better never leave them alone. So once we're up and running and doing implementation, there's loads more opportunities for rowdy assumptions to pop up. Unforeseen problems are popping up 24/7. This is game design, right? Checking in with our collaborators is pretty much the only tool we have for engaging with those assumptions. So it's something we should take seriously, especially when we're collaborating remotely. If the purpose of our check-ins is at least partially to continue to reduce assumptions as they arise, then that can help establish cadence and language for these things. So something that we run into a lot, sort of the in-progress version of pass-failing ideas, is when we bake some kind of accidental hostility into the way we get calibrated about progress with our teammates. So we might ask questions like, oh, hey, is that done yet? Or, oh, are we not doing feature X anymore? And those things don't really sound all that aggressive when you're asking them. But when you have to answer them, it gets kind of complicated. It's pretty easy to find yourself having to first defend your progress before you can even share what your progress is. So it's actually just kind of more assumptions happening. So this is one of our kind of safer go-to check-in phrases. It's pretty neutral, and it's a good way to kick off getting caught up and calibrated with teammates. They can start by just talking about the progress. They don't have to start by defending their work or by making a bunch of fresh assumptions about why it sounds like they have to defend their work. This is just for calibration. And similar to risks and benefits, I think when we tone down the aggressiveness of our inquiries, we get this knock-on effect of making empathetic or timid teammates kind of more confident about doing check-ins because they won't have to worry as much about accidentally putting someone in a defensive place. So less assumptions on both ends. And your studio might have a different key phrase that works better than this one, right? And that's great. But the important thing is for it to be kind of neutral and for it to be primarily about calibration. And the last thing for, I think, these progress check-ins and short little one-on-one type sessions is to remember that power dynamics exist. And this is maybe a little bit more for people who are like in charge of a team or something, but It doesn't, I personally don't care like how flat or how much of a family your organization is or whatever. There's a power imbalance somewhere, and that's going to affect what people say and to whom they say it. So I don't think it's enough for leads and reports to just talk to each other. I think having some kind of a peer check-in system to help people build confidence and similar to risk and benefits, to create a system where good and important issues can filter up and become more likely to be raised with people who are viewed as leadership or senior in a team, help get those issues to them more and more as time passes. Okay, so two last things I want to cover are things that have been coming up for us internally for basically forever. So meetings and check-ins obviously are important, especially now that we're all working remotely, and they can be really purposeful and positive and helpful, or crucial, I guess. But there are a couple of danger zones, and internally we refer to these as on the spots and rabbit holes. So on the spots is when you're like partway through the call, someone asks something like, "Hey, so can you have that task done by, when?" And sometimes that's a fine question, but sometimes that's a really big question, and it requires a detailed estimate. It requires buy-in from other team members. You need to go look up how long that's going to take, and you may find yourself sitting there on the call going like, it'll be done on maybe Thursday, or and maybe you even pass the buck and you're like, Karen, what do you think when it will be done? So just don't do this, right? There's an example, though, of a good answer you can give when somebody, don't do this to other people, obviously, but when you're in this situation, you can say things like this. You can say, "Oh, I can get that information to you later today, or tomorrow morning, or however long it's going to take to do the estimate." You don't have to actually solve the whole problem, right? And because a lot of times people don't actually need to know the real answer to these questions during a meeting. A lot of the time they just need to be able to start making a plan. And so if you can say, "I can get you a good, informed, thoughtful answer tomorrow morning," that's enough. They can make a plan around that. And that's a lot better than having to deal with some kind of a panicked or inaccurate answer. And it's also a lot better than sort of knowing that you're going to run into these situations and calls, not have a plan for what to do about it, and starting to have anxiety about attending meetings just in general. So the other thing is rabbit holes, right? Which is you're in a meeting, maybe one or two people, which maybe is you. I am responsible for these way more often than is appropriate. You go off on a kind of a specific topic in more and more and more depth. And meanwhile, there's a bunch of people on the call or in the meeting who are really not part of the conversation anymore. This isn't necessarily toxic or harmful on its own. And rabbit holes are usually where we find good answers to hard problems. And they're also kind of fun. But they're also time consuming. They're kind of disrespectful. And they're gradually going to make folks feel wary of or exhausted by attending meetings at all. And meetings are your main thing that you're using, hopefully, to communicate with everyone and get calibrated and figure out what you're supposed to be doing and who's on this next thing with you. So they're pretty easy to avoid, though, in a way that I think is pretty polite and helpful, which is basically try to get it paused and moved to just a separate follow-up call. This is... I've seen this happen in meetings that I've been in the last couple of weeks, and I've always been really, really thankful for it. I guess main thing that I want to reiterate for all of this stuff is that everything that I've been talking about is stuff that we do every week now. And we used to not do any of these things. If you go back far enough, none of this stuff was part of our process. And that sucked pretty bad. And I'm really glad we started doing this stuff. And I'm also excited to keep just making more improvements in these processes, using these ways of looking at how we work. So yeah, quick summary. Engaging in a functional and productive collaborative planning process has been leading us to more cool stuff than I can even keep track of. Using mock-ups, even bad ones, to clear up confusion has been totally indispensable. insisting on reorienting abstract discussions about ideas to instead be about risks and benefits has been pretty life-changing. Improving the way that we do our check-ins and our meetings, even just trying to improve our understanding of what these things are for, making sure they're about calibration and that we're just doing a good job there. That's been the difference between shipping games and like our company falling apart. And every time we get better at these things, we see morale and communication improvements. So also, like, these are really non-trivial and also to me counterintuitive problems. And the thing that I keep noticing is that we can make really small changes and get these very big improvements. A lot of these things that we encounter are very much like the small pebble in your shoe that'll give you a big blister if you leave it in there. But if you get it out, you're fine. And we also view all of these things as work in progress processes. These are things that need as much iteration and refinement as game ideas do. But again, I think like earlier, it's a good sign when applying these processes to themselves tend to make themselves better instead of worse. So I think that's about it for me. I hope this was a helpful head start for folks on some of these things. I'm curious if folks are running into these issues in their new remote work situations. And I think I just wanted to end by saying life finds a way.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Adam. So we're just going to move into the questions, right? I don't see any questions under the absentee channel right now. So just going to look at the Crash Course chat. All right, so I actually have a question personally. I don't have it typed out here. I'm going to ramble a bit so other people can, put together their thoughts. Adam,
perfect.
As a, I guess as a solo indie, like what aspects of, how can you adapt some of the principles you just talked about for like a solo indie? And specifically thinking about like rabbit holes and the pros and cons.
Yeah, I think these things are the dynamics like this are most likely to come out in your own work practices. So like for me, I used to work as essentially a solo indie. I could make my own music and sound effects and animation and programming and everything. And I feel like the way it expresses itself there, it's different, but you can sense some of the weird similarities. So for example, if I got stuck on a problem late at night, I used to just like stay up as long as it took to fix the problem, even though probably if I just went to bed and woke up, I'd be able to fix it in like 5 minutes. And instead I'd lose 5 hours just like banging my head against the screen, trying to figure out, this one last little piece of it. And I think that kind of thing is not super uncommon when you're a solo developer. But I think the thing you're also going to run into, likely as a solo developer, is, basically, unless you're making like free games, I don't know that there's any such thing as a solo developer anymore. Like, if you're trying to sell games, you either have a publisher or you're working with a storefront to get your game listed, or you are trying to talk to press about covering your game. If you're doing commercial game development, you're collaborating with people. They might not be on your internal team or something, but I think all of these things apply to all of these other situations. It's very easy to be on the phone with a publisher or a funding partner and have them ask a question that you just can't answer on that call. And like having enough confidence to say like, oh, dang, that's a good question. I want to do it justice. I'll send you an email tomorrow morning with more information about that. Like that's a great way to handle that situation. And yeah, I think anybody who's doing commercial game development, regardless of team size, is going to run into stuff like that.
All right. think I agree with everything you just stated there. I think personally I still fall into the trap of thinking myself as solo, but when you really think about it, even the people in the Discord chat here, I are by extension part of my team when I'm bouncing ideas off of them, or when I'm talking to somebody else about audio, or asking for feedback on a build. So yeah, I do think that personally, I can be a little bit more thoughtful in terms of how we communicate. Like Graham pointed out, I need to stop asking people direct questions on the spot a bit, but that's it.
Well, sometimes people have questions. Like there's always this. A lot of these things, I like to talk about these things with different sizes of team and people who work at different levels within teams are often different if they are in charge of a team or like part of a team but not the one in charge. Like everybody's going to see different sides of this problem, but everybody can do work on it, and the more people that are doing work on it, regardless of what side of the problem they're on, the more people are going to have like expectations about how to solve these problems well. Sometimes you have to ask people questions about due dates. Like, I don't think there's a way to like magic that problem out of our processes, but that can either be solved from the top down by saying like, oh, hey, I have a question about deadlines. Can you get me more info by tomorrow? Or it can be solved from the bottom up by saying like, oh, I don't have that info, but I can get it to you tomorrow. And in both cases, I think like because these are situations you're gonna encounter over and over and over across the course of any project, I think people from lots of different levels or lots of different levels of power within any team can make a actual functional difference in how communication goes on all of these topics.
All right. Thank you for the thoughtful answer there. I see Dave has a question in the chat. How big are the games currently being worked on in terms of team size, like just generally? I mean, that seems kind of like a loaded question, but I don't know how you want to tackle that one, Adam.
All mix. I would say a lot of Finji games, I think, have team sizes that are anywhere from, I would say 5 to 10 people, roughly. I think when you start to think about like, how many people do we have to communicate with on a regular basis to get these games launched, then that starts to be a trickier question to narrow down. But we have in terms of like full-time core creative collaborators on games that we publish or develop, I would say we have teams as small as 2 to 3 full-time people doing what we would consider traditional game content. But even those teams usually have, there's a part-time producer, or Beck and I are checking in with them, or there's maybe a platform partner who needs regular updates, that kind of thing. So yeah, it varies quite a bit. Like on any given week, I probably personally work with about 30 people, but that's across 5 or 6 different game projects.
All right. Dave, I don't know if that answered your question directly, or you wanted to get something a bit more specific.
No, that's great. I was just basically curious because team dynamics can change a lot based off of how big your organization is. So that kind of helped put context to the material.
Yeah, I think my experience is mostly with teams that are going to be like 15 people or smaller for the most part. I suspect that there is a version of a lot of these things that will still be helpful at organizations above that size, but I'm not sure what that actually looks like on the ground personally.
Okay. Graham, okay, you have some questions, but they're not related to the talk. Going to skip over you for a second. Rain Drinker asks, how much do you encourage different teams of the game/studio to be aware of what the people in other teams are doing? Are the programmers aware of day to day of what the concept artists are doing, for example? Do they communicate those things in a group meeting? So I think Rain Drinker, you're asking basically how much communication happens between the different, for lack of a better word, silos or groups. I mean, we don't want silos, but
right. Yeah, well, and I think there's a question of like, does that communication only happen during, like formal overlap, like in meetings or stuff like that, or is it more fluid? For us, it's kind of a mix. We've got a lot of people. Like our Slack server is not super siloed, so it's pretty easy for folks to kind of like see what's going on with marketing, and for marketing folks to see what's going on with prototyping and stuff like that. I would say within any given team, we generally have a really high amount of direct communication between people who are in kind of different disciplines. So it's not uncommon at all for us to have programmers talking directly to artists, for designers to be talking directly to audio people or whatever. That's not weird for our setup at all. The things that meetings and check-ins are super big decisions, and building confidence in those decisions. So once the decisions are made and everybody is pretty much on board with next steps, then I think a lot of the kind of like normal discipline overlap, people talking to each other while they try to get things rigged up and working. I don't like the amount of friction that's introduced by saying like, oh, programmer hit a problem that can be solved by an art asset according to a spec that's already been signed off on. They have to go through me to get approval to request that asset or something. Like that's usually too high friction for, at least for a team our size. Yeah, I think we do a mix. I think the thing that took me a long time to come around to, and that I feel really strongly about now, is not relying on people to naturally talk to each other as your only method of calibrating and doing collaboration. And I actually would be really wary of an organization that only did communication through meetings. I really like having both things going on because I think they serve pretty different purposes. There's actually another part of this question though that I'll try to address as quickly as I can, which is there's a dynamic that can come out of this, which is in the talk a little teeny bit, which is it's easy. I have in the past, at least, been in a position where I would have the mindset of, oh, the programmers and concept artists talk all the time, so programmer probably knows any stuff that concept artist knows and vice versa. And so I would have questions for the concept artist like, oh, why'd you do it this way? That's not how the programming works. And that's an absurd question. They're the concept artists. They're not in charge of the programming. So I think it can be, I don't like when we take like good communication and people talking to each other in a natural, reasonable, human way, using that to create a situation where someone can be blamed for not knowing something that it's not their responsibility to know. I think that's something that's really valuable to try to avoid, and that's why I like having meetings in the mix.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Makes a lot of sense. I'm in a bit of a company where most of the communication is done through meetings and all the explanations about friction, and having to go through the lead to report something make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it can be kind of a drag sometimes, and like sometimes things just need approval, no matter what you do. But I think having, sort of nurturing a process where people trust that, people will check in when they need to, but if somebody needs a graphic adjusted and they're in charge of programming that part where the graphics used, that like trust that they're making the right call, and that this is, you know, similar to past situations that have worked fine.
Okay. Rain Drinker, did that answer your question completely, or do you want to go a little bit more in detail?
Yeah. It was very, very thorough. Thanks a lot.
I see Graham asking, related to collaboration, in a mostly online world these days, how have you gone about finding the right people to collaborate with? Alternatively, how have people found you / gotten your attention? So you're hitting the nail on the head with the COVID question there, Graham. But
yes, the good answer to this question probably would take like 90 minutes or something to walk through. So I'll try to do like a couple of like little light points that have made a big difference for us. One is, Beck and I do a mix of things. I'll try to answer the second question first. So how have people found us or gotten our attention? We've done a lot of, Beck and I do like kind of like this, honestly, a fair amount of outreach in the form of talks, in the form of mentorship, and we also maintain a pretty big network of folks who we think are interesting and do interesting creative work. And it's not rare for folks to reach out to us because they came across us somewhere, either doing a talk somewhere, or they saw one of our talks when they were in school, or we mentored them on a train ride across the United States one time, or whatever. And that's something that we actually had to kind of double down on when we were kind of entering phase 2 of the Finji project. Was like, we like doing this, right? This is cool, right? And we do like doing it, and we do think it is cool. And one reason is because folks who want to work with us in the way that we like to work are maybe more likely to find us. In terms of us going about finding the right people to collaborate with outside of these things, we have had some really successful open calls for new collaborators, and I think it is it's a fair amount of work, but not as much work as it seems, to do that well and to do it in a way that gets you good candidates. I think it is often done very poorly. I think the world is full of job wanted posts from game studios that are like, come out here and be a rock star programming ninja and solve problems while you chug Mountain Dew, gamers, whatever. Like that, for us, that's not going to yield a good group of folks that we want to spend time working with, probably. So we got great mentorship from the Bento Miso folks, Jenny and Henry Faber up in Toronto. They actually took a bunch of time to mentor us on how to write we want to hire someone in this discipline, how to talk to people and how to prioritize the kinds of skills and values that people have that we're attracted to. We want people who are relatively independent because we work remotely, relatively autonomous. you.